So good evening, and welcome to St. Johnsbury Academy. I'm Sarah Gary, the class of 92, and the Director of Health Services here at the Academy. We are very excited to be partnering with families in our community to better understand anxiety and how to support our students, our own children, and maybe even ourselves. This evening, we are lucky enough to have Lynn Lyons here to guide us through this conversation. Lynn is a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist in Concord, New Hampshire. She has been in private practice for over 30 years, specializing in the treatment of anxiety disorders in adults and children. Lynn travels internationally as a speaker and trainer on the subject of anxiety, its role in families, and the need for a preventative approach at home and in schools. She is a sought-after expert, appearing in the New York Times, NPR, Psychology Today, and other media outlets. With a special interest in breaking the generational cycle of worry in families, Lynn is the author and co-author of several books and articles on anxiety, including Anxious Kids, Anxious Parents, 7 Ways to Stop the Worry Cycle and Raise Courageous and Independent Children, and the combination book for kids, Playing with Anxiety, Casey's Guide for Teens and Kids. Her latest book, which actually comes out in October, is called The Anxiety Audit. She is also the co-host with her sister-in-law of a great podcast called Flustercluck. You can find that on her website, Lynn Lyons. But we are very excited. We spent 3 hours with Lynn today, our faculty, learning some great information about how we can help our students better in the classroom, and we're super excited to have her here to talk with all of you. So please help me welcome Lynn.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to St. Johnsbury for having me. I was telling the faculty this afternoon, my husband actually went to Burke Mountain Academy, and my mother-in-law, my in-laws lived in East Burke until just last year. I think they sold, it was sort of a COVID thing, remember that? So he drove up here with me this morning and he dropped me off, and I haven't seen him since. So hopefully he'll come back and get me. But he certainly knows his way around. So thank you, Sarah, for that nice introduction. So as Sarah said, I'm a therapist. I still see families. I still have a practice. I'll drive home tonight and I'll see a bunch of people tomorrow, and I'll see a bunch of people on Friday. And when I'm not on the road, I'm still working with families. I feel like I couldn't do this if I weren't still in practice, if I weren't still talking to families, talking to kids. I work with a ton of teenagers. I very much value these relationships that I have with families, where a family might come in because they've got an 8-year-old who's struggling, and then they get some help and they figure things out, and then middle school comes along, and so they show up again, and then high school. And I even was working with someone who I met when she was 12, and she came back recently and she just had her first baby. So it's nice to have these relationships with families. So has anybody felt anxious at all over the last few years? Yeah. Even before the pandemic, I used to say that it was a good business to be in. If you want steady work, just go into the anxiety biz, and that's certainly the case now. Anxiety and its pal, depression, which I'll talk a little bit about too, because the two are so closely related in many ways. Things weren't great before the pandemic. So when we were looking at the numbers and kids struggling and teenagers struggling and adults even struggling, we were on this nice steady climb, and then the pandemic happened and the climb sort of went, but I have some good news about that too. I think that what we're going to see over the next few years is an increasing awareness of how we deal with this. But having been in this profession for 30 some odd years now, there are also a lot of things that really need to be better explained and better approached with our young people. There's a ton of misinformation out there, and one of the things I try and do when I'm talking to families and I'm talking to kids is to make sure that you guys have as good an understanding as you possibly can about the way this anxiety thing works. And so I'm going to give you information about that. The other thing too to know about anxiety is that it's normal. Is that we're designed to feel this way, that this whole system in our body is set up to protect us. And so it's not going anywhere. So the idea that we're going to get rid of it, and whenever I see a book that says, like, free your child from anxiety or never feel anxiety again, I don't think they have the same brain that I have. because it's really going to be a part of our life, and that's okay. It's really a matter of managing it rather than trying to get rid of it. So let me dive in a little bit and tell you about how anxiety works and the important things that you should know. First of all, anxiety and worry are technically different things, but everybody uses the terms interchangeably, and I do too, and it's not a big deal. But just for your own information, let me just explain the difference. Worry is actually a cognitive process that happens up here in our prefrontal cortex. So when we're worrying about something, we're thinking, we're imagining, we're creating a story, we're anticipating. We're in our head and we're thinking, oh God, what could happen? And most of the time when we talk about worry, we're talking about worry about something that's in the future. Some people worry about things that have already happened. So if you tend to be more socially anxious, for example, you might worry that you said the wrong thing or that you made a mistake. You might worry that you hurt somebody's feelings. And that's often called ruminating. But, this is splitting hairs. But worry is this sort of anticipatory thing. David Barlow, who is retired now, but he was the head of the Boston University Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders. He defined anxiety as an overestimation of the problem and an underestimation of your resources to deal with it, which I think is such a great definition because it really shows that there's sort of an imbalance. So worry is this thing that goes on up here, and then technically anxiety refers to the physical symptoms that show up when you fire off your fight or flight system. Not when you need it, because when you need your fight or flight system, you need it. And if you're running away from a grizzly bear, people don't say like, gosh, why do I feel so anxious, right? You're just running away from the grizzly bear. Anxiety is the state that happens, not when we're in danger, but when we anticipate or imagine that we're in danger. And it has a really good way of sort of grabbing on, getting hold of you, and then your relationship with your anxiety or your worry, whichever you want to call it, is really what I talk about most frequently. So this is what anxiety wants. Now, there are a whole bunch of different diagnostic categories, and I could go through them, but that's not really all that necessary, because no matter what category we put the anxiety in, whether or not you're anxious about flying, anxious about snakes, anxious about public speaking, anxious about everything, it doesn't really matter to me, because anxiety does this. It wants certainty and comfort. Anxiety says, I have to know exactly what's going to happen, and I need to be comfortable while I'm doing it. And the problem is that for parents, and oftentimes for teachers, and then for teenagers as they move into young adulthood, it seems like a good idea to give anxiety what it wants. Because in the short term, that works. My grandmother used to say, what's easy now is hard later. And that's sort of and what's hard now is easy later. And that's sort of the way it works with this anxiety thing. When we give it what it wants, it calms down. So if you're afraid of getting into an elevator and you're really good at avoiding elevators, you'll be okay until that time when you have to go into an elevator. And then when you step out of the elevator, you feel better. But what happens when we give the anxiety what it wants is it becomes more powerful. So think of anxiety and worry as a cult leader. And with any cult leader, right, if you listen to what the cult leader says, things go fairly smoothly. If you ignore or disobey the cult leader, that's when things get more problematic. That's when things get messy. And so when anxiety shows up and says, I have to know exactly what's going to happen, or I have to feel comfortable as I do this. And if we say to the anxiety, all right, look, we're going to make sure that everything goes as planned. We're going to make sure that you know exactly what's going to happen. The anxiety says, thank you so much for doing my bidding. And it gets stronger and more powerful. So the goal isn't to have chaotic lives where you don't make plans and you just do whatever happens. But the goal is to recognize that being able to tolerate uncertainty, being able to step into situations where you don't know exactly what's going to happen, or handle situations when things don't go the way that you want them to go, is an enormously helpful skill. As a therapist, I am very concrete. I am consistently in my head. It's like I have a bullseye target out in front of me. And when I'm working with a family, I'm thinking, okay, so what are the resources that I'm going to use here? What are the things that this family has going for it, right? Are they curious? Do they have a good sense of humor? Are they warm? Are they determined? Are they competitive? Are they stubborn? What are these great qualities that I can use? And then where is the gap? What's missing? What's the skill or skills that I'm trying to teach? That's how I go about my practice. So when I'm thinking about anxiety, when I'm thinking about worry, it's all for me about the skills I want to make sure that you have as young people and as parents. And by the way, I'm so pleased to see so many young people. Lots of times I do a talk and there's like one teenager that got dragged there sitting in the back row. And so it's nice that all of you guys came out to see me, so I appreciate that. Even if you're here against your will, thank you. So what we want to do is we want to figure out, well, if anxiety wants certainty and comfort, and if anxiety wants to, we want to get rid of anxiety, are we doing the very things that serve the cult leader? Are we, what I call, doing the disorder? So just so you know, anxiety is pretty socially contagious. One of the things we know is that anxiety is passed, like many other things, from the grown-ups in a family to the young people in a family. And it's also passed in other cultures. So it might be in a school setting. It might be in an office environment. Anxiety is really contagious. Once we start paying attention to what the patterns are that anxiety does, what are the risk factors? What are the things that keep this thing going? And what are the skills that we want to learn instead? Then we can begin to dismantle it a little bit. So 4 things, and I was talking to the faculty this afternoon, and I was like, wait, I can't remember the 4 things. I remember them now. There are 4 things that we know that kids raised in anxious environments tend to experience. The first thing is they're lousy at tolerating uncertainty. Not surprising, anxiety says, I want certainty. The second thing is that kids raised in anxious environments are not very good independent problem solvers. So we know if you're raised in a family where there's a lot of anxiety, oftentimes the grown-ups step in very quickly to solve problems, and they don't give kids the chance to sort of muddle through. Very closely related to that is that kids raised in anxious environments score lower on the autonomy scales than we'd like. So their sense of independence, their sense of mastery isn't exactly where we want it to be. And then the 4th thing is that these kids raised in anxious environments perceive the world as a more dangerous place. So it doesn't mean that we want kids to be careless and not pay attention to their environment and take risks without thinking. It's just that if you are raised by an anxious parent, if you're raised in an anxious environment, you have a hard time assessing reasonable risk. The ability to assess reasonable risk is an enormously important skill. But when kids are grow up in an overly anxious environment, they don't develop that skill. And the default for anxiety is always avoidant. Anxiety, no thank you, I'm out. I say this to families all the time. If you're anxious and you're avoidant, and you have a hard time tolerating uncertainty, and you don't want to feel uncomfortable, so you're backing up all the time, your world gets smaller. Anxiety doesn't care at all if you guys get your driver's license, if you graduate from high school, if you try out for the school play, if you try out for the soccer team, if you ask somebody you like to go out with you. It doesn't care at all. Anxiety is not interested in you being out in the world. Anxiety is interested in this. And the more that you say no thank you, and the more that the anxiety says, oh, I appreciate so much that you're doing my bidding, the more likely you are to be disconnected socially. And so when we talk about the pandemic, that's what was so hard on teenagers, is that they are hardwired for social connection. You teenagers are supposed to be together with your peers. That's what your brains are doing. Middle schoolers, they're supposed to be together and literally be like banging into each other and figuring out how to be human beings, right? There's just a big mess. And we took away that opportunity for them to be messy. They missed out on a lot of that. Does it mean that it's gone forever? I do not believe so, not at all. But when we look at what the pandemic did, the pandemic almost mirrored what anxiety does, is that it took you out of your lives and it got you socially rusty. So now, as you step back into this school year, you're going to start being able to work those muscles again, which is awesome. Does that mean that it's going to feel comfortable all the time? No. Does it mean that you're going to feel certain all the time? Not at all. But it means that you're going to get the opportunity to practice managing when things don't go the way that you expect. In a normal way, not in a way that says in March 2020, we didn't expect this, everybody just stay in your houses. There was a family that came to see me a while ago, many years ago now actually. And this was a girl, she was probably about 10, and she went to a nice school, it was in a suburb, and they carpooled. And the mom came in, and the daughter was very worried, anxiety, bossing her around. And I said, well, give me an example of how you manage worry. And the mom said, well, this is what we do. I said, just give me an example of something that makes her worry and what you do. She said, well, she worries a lot about carpool. She worries that she's not going to know who's going to pick her up, that the parent isn't going to be there, that she's not going to be able to figure out what to do. And so what we've done to manage her worry is that we write down the carpool schedule, we color-coded it, we make a copy that we put on the refrigerator. She has a copy that she brings with her to school. She has one in her pocket, she has one in her backpack, so she always knows exactly who's going to pick her up. And whenever she begins to worry about it or wonder about it, she can take out her thing and she can see, oh, it's going to be Mrs. Perkins today. So I was just curious, because remember, one of the skills, when anxiety takes over, one of the skills that happens is that kids have less independent problem solving. So just out of curiosity, I turned to this girl, and I said to her, I forget her name, but let's just say her name was Amelia. I said, Amelia, what would you do if you came out of your school and the parent that was supposed to pick you up for carpool that day wasn't there? What would you do? And before I could even put the question mark at the end of the sentence, the mom turned and she grabbed Amelia's hands. And she looked Amelia in the eye and she said, Amelia, look at me. We will never let that happen. Do you understand? And then she gave me like the side eye, like. Now what I saw in that moment was several things. One is that this mom really believed, truly, that she was helping her daughter. And she was working for the worry because it's easier to get through the day short term if you give worry what it wants. She wanted her daughter to go to school. She didn't want her daughter to fret all day that she was at school. She didn't want to have conversations over and over and over again. So she gave the information to her daughter that worry wanted. So I totally understood that. But there was no independent problem solving. There was no opportunity for her to figure out what to do. And in the larger schema of things, if these girls walked out of their nice school and the mom wasn't there, that's going to be a pretty easy problem to solve, isn't it? They go back into the school and they say, Mrs. Perkins isn't here. She's supposed to pick us up. Well, gosh, let's call her. But there was no opportunity for that. And that's what we have to be careful about with this thing. Is because little by little it sucks us in to believing that the way to handle worry, the way to manage anxiety, is to, interestingly, simultaneously give it what it wants and try and get rid of it. And both of those strategies, paradoxically, make it stronger. So, how does this thing work? What does it do? Well, it does the same thing all the time. So no matter what you worry about, this thing works the same. And if you are a little bit of a worrier or a big major worrier, doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter to me if you worry about huge things like death or little things like spiders in the bathtub. This is the way this thing works. So, by the way, I always give this information to the people that I'm working with and talking to, and most of them didn't have it. Don't have it, which is interesting to me because a lot of them have been perhaps in therapy with somebody else for years about their anxiety, and when I offer this information, they're like, oh my gosh, I never knew that. This is really helpful information for all of us to have. So this is how this thing works. Let me put my clicker down because I don't need it. All right, so you've got to worry. You're worrying about something. So one of you young people, yell up to me something that you might worry about. Public speaking, starting school, right? First day of school, right? The list is endless. Public speaking. All right, so you have to start school. And maybe on the first day of school, you have to give a speech, so it's a double whammy. So you have your prefrontal cortex up here. This is where your worry lives. Now, I like to name the worry. I like to pull it out. I like to give it a name because I want to create a little distance. My worry's name is Elizabeth Edith or Edith Elizabeth. I sort of switch it around. It's hyphenated. She is about my age, but she doesn't really take very good care of herself. Her hair is kind of messy. She wears curlers. She wears a sort of this ratty pink bathrobe, and she chain smokes. Right? So when Edith Elizabeth shows up, she has a few things that she says, right? And she says, her thing that she says is, "You're not going to be able to do this." Right? And she just sits there and says it. I know when she's going to show up. She usually shows up when I've got too much to do, when I've overbooked myself. Right? "You'll never get it done," she says. Now, in that moment, right, so I have to go to school, first day of school, I have to give a talk. Oh, gosh, people are going to judge me. And up here in my prefrontal cortex, my worry says some version of blah, 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 whatever it is, and you can't handle it. And so I begin to, I hear the worry, you hear your worry, make this announcement. It's an emergency. Worry loves to make things into an emergency. Oh gosh, so you start watching the movie. You start watching the movie of what's going to happen on the first day of school. You start watching the movie about what's going to happen if you have to stand up and give a speech in front of your peers. And you get absorbed in that movie. And as you're imagining that, your prefrontal cortex sends a message to another part of your brain called your amygdala. Your amygdala is a small structure. There's actually a pair of them midbrain. It's about the size and shape of an almond. If we drilled into your head, we'd hit it. This is new and fancy. This is sophisticated. This is where we imagine. This is where we create. This is where they invented cars and laptops. This is where you think about what you're going to do next week. This is primitive. The job of your amygdala is to receive signals and determine in a flash of a second, danger or no danger. Danger, no danger. It does not have the capacity to determine whether or not you're just imagining something terrible happening or whether it's actually happening. So you're imagining going to school, you're imagining getting lost, you're imagining all the things you imagine. And a message goes to your amygdala. Your amygdala has one response and one response only, and the response is, "My girl's in trouble." The amygdala then sends a message down to your adrenal glands, which are back here, which now pump you full of norepinephrine and epinephrine, also known as noradrenaline and adrenaline. These chemicals, these messengers in your body, are going to activate and deactivate certain things in your body that are designed to save your life. The amygdala doesn't say, "Oh, for the love of Pete, are we going to do this again? How many years have you started school in August or September?" Right? It's not an emergency. The amygdala doesn't do that. The amygdala treats every danger message from you as if you are being chased by a grizzly bear. So now it's going to save you. And the way it's going to save you, it's going to increase your heart rate, and it's going to increase your breathing because we want blood and oxygen to these big running away muscles. So your heart rate goes up. Your breathing quickens. If you keep doing this, you will hyperventilate and start to feel dizzy. Your pupils will dilate so you can scan the environment and see where the grizzly bear is. We're going to throw some extra blood clotting stuff into your system in case the grizzly bear rips off your arm. Maybe you'll clot up and bleed out. Pretty cool. The other thing that it does, and this is really, really important for all of you to know, is that it shuts down non-essential systems. So very cleverly, when this fight or flight system gets activated, its job is to protect you, and it is not going to waste any energy on the systems that aren't needed in that moment. There are a lot of systems that aren't needed in that moment, a lot of parts of you that aren't needed in that moment. One significant one is your digits. Your fingers and your toes are not needed in this primitive place where the amygdala is if you're running away from a grizzly bear. We want the big muscles to be activated, so we're going to pull the blood into your core and your big muscles, which means that your fingers and your toes and sometimes your face might feel numb and tingly. It's a very common reaction that people have when they start feeling anxious. So now your heart is pounding, your breathing is quick, you're feeling a little dizzy, your pupils are dilated, which you probably won't really notice. Your fingers and your toes are a little tingly, maybe your face too. And then also your body says, you know what, we don't need to digest your tuna fish sandwich right now. We're going to cease operations. Your digestive system during this reaction is a non-essential system. It stops digesting. And when your body stops digesting, your stomach doesn't feel good. You often feel sick. Sometimes people throw up. The process of this fight or flight system, shutting down your digestive system, wreaks havoc with tummy aches. Now, sometimes it's dramatic, but other times, imagine if you're just sort of chronically stressed. Imagine if you're just worrying all the time about what's going to happen. Maybe you don't even know what you're worried about. You're just sort of like, oh, life is uncertain. I don't know what tomorrow is going to be like. And all of this consistent firing off of this system, your poor tummy doesn't really function very well. A lot of people end up going to GI docs to try and figure out what's wrong with their tummy. A lot of kids go to figure out what's wrong with their tummy. And it really has just been sort of this chronic worrying in your poor body trying to adapt this very primitive system to a very modern world. This is really modern and fancy. This is not. They don't operate very well together. But we don't want to get rid of our amygdala. One little girl said to me, why don't we just have our amygdala removed? Well, because when you need it, you need it. When there's a grizzly bear, you want it to be activated. That fight or flight system is key to your survival, just not so much when you're starting your first day of school or when you have to stand up and give a presentation to your classmates. So all of this happens, you have the physical response. Now say you have no idea what's going on and you start having these physical responses. Maybe you go to the emergency room, you think you're having a heart attack, or you go to your doctor, or you go to the school nurse, or you hide under your bed. Oh my gosh, what's happening, what's happening? And somebody explains it to you, and maybe they do a workup to find out that there really is, you're not having a heart attack, and they say, well, we think that, you're anxious. Now, at that point, you either believe them or you don't. If you believe them, and when it happens again, then you might say, oh no, oh no, oh no, I'm getting anxious. Oh no, not this again. What if I am standing up in front of people and I get red blotches on my face and I forget what I'm going to say? What if I throw up? What if I have diarrhea? What if I make a fool of myself? You know that it's your anxiety, but you still don't want to feel it. If you don't know what it is and it shows up, you say, oh no, what's going on? Either way, your poor amygdala gets the message, yikes, it's worse than I thought. Quick, jack them up. And like spray bottles, they give you another dose of this, and now you're off to the races. This is how it works for everybody all the time. This is how it works. And so what we try to do, what people have tried to do, it hasn't really worked out very well, is that try to get rid of anxious events. So how can we make sure that you're not triggered? How can we make sure that we take you out of situations which trigger your anxiety, that make you feel anxious, right? We can try that. Not very effective, because it makes your world smaller, and you also don't get the opportunity to step into things and give the amygdala some different information. So you become avoidant. But certainly that's what people try and do. They also try and get rid of worried thoughts. So we do things like say, well, we'll do thought stopping. Thought stopping is this technique that was taught for a while, which it's literally like, don't think that. Now, if that worked, I'd be on board. My job would be super easy. You come in to see me, and you've been worrying for years that you're gonna, I don't know, you're gonna get cancer, or you're gonna get bit by a dog, or whatever. And you come in and say, I just think about this all the time. Or little Amelia, I just worry all the time that somebody's not gonna pick me up after school. And I say, well, don't think that. People be like, what? That is so helpful. Thank you very much, right? I could see like 14 people an hour. Yeah, no, just don't think that. Oh my gosh, that is an amazing, helpful piece of advice, right? Doesn't work, because when we tell ourselves not to think about something, we think about something. If I tell you guys right now not to think about your favorite dessert, under no circumstances, don't think right now about your favorite dessert, whoop, up it pops. So telling somebody not to think about something is not particularly helpful. We're not going to get rid of your amygdala for reasons that I just stated. When you need it, you need it. So we're going to leave your amygdala there. We're not even going to fully get rid of physical responses, because this thing happens. It's happened to all of us. You all of a sudden you realize that you're getting on a plane and you forgot your passport. Or you're like me, you're getting on a plane with your 2 young sons to go to Disney World, and you forgot the tickets to Disney World, which in the old days there were things called tickets that you had to have. Right? And immediately in that moment, you're going to have the reaction. So we're not going to get rid of the physical responses. Sometimes, I mean, obviously I speak for a living and I like to do it and it doesn't make me nervous, except if there are a few people in the audience, one being some of my teachers, my mentors. If they show up, I can feel my heart rate go up a little bit. I can feel those physical symptoms. But the goal isn't to get rid of those physical responses. The more you try and get rid of this thing, the stronger it gets. That's the paradoxical nature of it. But what we can do is we can start dealing with it right here. So instead of saying, oh, I'm not supposed to feel anxious, what's wrong with me, I shouldn't feel this way, we can start saying, of course, as I start at a new school, or of course as I have to give a presentation, of course as I'm handling this thing that feels uncertain or uncomfortable, of course. And that way it doesn't spiral up into this place where really the spiral is based on trying to get rid of it, which is really counterintuitive. That the more you try and get rid of this anxiety thing, the stronger it gets. Yep, that's exactly how it works. And people will find all sorts of ways to not feel what they're feeling. And most of them are not so helpful because it's avoidance, it's isolation, it's missing out on things, it's making your world smaller, it's not taking reasonable risks. Sometimes it's substances or other things, other chemicals we take to try and get rid of the feelings. The more you try and push it away, the stronger it gets. So the elimination strategies that people often are taught, that I hear, that I know are taught all the time because I talk to people all the time, the 2 most popular ones that we're taught to deal with worry are breathing and distraction. Now, they both have their place. Distraction. If you have a toddler, distraction is saving your life. Stick with it. Right? Ooh, look over there. Distraction is not all bad. And there are even times where I'm sure, we've all been in this situation where we're just stuck thinking about something, right? We're just, oh gosh, we have something we need to do, or we have to have a conversation with somebody that we know is going to be uncomfortable, and we're just chewing our mental cud. And so we say, you know what, I need to just distract myself from this for a while. I need to get away from this. I prefer the term unhook rather than distract. So distraction has its place. And breathing, of course, has its place because breathing, I'm all for breathing, total fan of breathing. And when we do that breathing, when we take those slow breaths, we are actually giving the amygdala the message that we are not in a war zone. We are not being chased by a grizzly bear. If you go to the vet with your dog and you look around, they all have their, not all of them, but a lot of them have their amygdalas fired up, right? And they're, your cat is panting and making that noise that the cat makes before it throws up. You all know that noise. I'm a cat person, right? For those of you who have cats, they go like this, right? You know they're about to throw up. When you change your breathing, your primitive brain says, hey, wait a second. That's not the kind of breathing we do if we're being chased by a grizzly bear. This is some information that I should pay attention to. It regulates your nervous system. It gets your feet back under you. So breathing is an enormously helpful thing to do as a way to re-steady yourself so you can move forward. Breathing is a bridge. Breathing is a reboot. Breathing is a reset. But it doesn't get rid of your worry. If you are worried that you are going to throw up, breathing doesn't get rid of that worry. If you worry that you're going to say something and make a fool of yourself, Breathing doesn't get rid of that worry. So it's used as a reset, but it's not in and of itself going to change the patterns that we want to go after. Distraction, and I know that a lot of kids are taught distraction, and a lot of adults are taught distraction, is sort of like, oh, I can't think about this. And again, it's like, oh, I can't think about that. The idea that you can't be exposed to the things that worry you is what makes this thing stronger. Oh, I can't think about that. So they use distraction. I had one boy, I was giving a talk in Chicago, and it was a group like this, and he was in the back, and then when I finished, he waited for people to leave, and he came down, and he said, what you said was interesting. And I said, well, what part? And he said, well, you were talking about distraction. And he said, I get really, really anxious thoughts, and sometimes I get really dark thoughts, and I don't like to think those things. I get so stressed out. And I have permission at my school that when I start having those thoughts, those worried thoughts that I don't like to have, those dark thoughts, I'm allowed to take out my phone and put in my earbuds and just blast music as loudly as I need to in my head because it prevents me from thinking those thoughts. That's not a strategy that I'm going to endorse. What I'm going to teach instead is how do you change your relationship to those thoughts when they show up? Because here's the thing, just because you think it doesn't make it so. Just because you think it doesn't mean you need to believe it. And by trying not to think it and not to experience it, you're making the problem worse. And kids will come to me and they'll say, well, I tried that. I tried that breathing thing. It didn't work. I tried that distraction thing. It didn't work. Yeah, I know. I know it didn't work because it wasn't enough. It can be helpful, the breathing, but it just wasn't enough. This is what we want to do, is that we want to start giving this amygdala, right? So here's the smoke maker, and here's the smoke detector, this amygdala. We want to start giving the amygdala different information. And that information comes from you. And it comes from you allowing your experiences to count. And it comes from you recognizing that you and Edith Ethel don't have to have this same conversation. That when you pull your worry out and when you give it a name and you begin to observe it a little bit, worry is not a good life coach. But we get sucked into it and we believe it and we want to talk about it. And we get caught up in the details and the minutiae. We get pulled into the weeds of it. Worry is going to show up for everybody. I am not afraid to fly. I fly all the time. When I get on an airplane, I know that there is a risk that that plane will crash. Why? Because it's not 100% safe. And we talk about it every single time I get on a plane. We have to have a discussion. If the plane crashes, they say, and then we go through the whole thing. So I think about it. And sometimes I imagine for a moment or two, like, God, that would be terrible. Several years ago, some of you may have remembered that on a Southwest jet, one of the engines came off and went and hit a window. Do you remember that? And then the person in that seat died. So I heard about that, and then about a week later, I was on a Southwest jet. And I was in that seat. I could look out and see the engine that came, not on the same plane, obviously, but I could look out and see it, and I could imagine. I have a very vivid imagination. So of course those thoughts are going to come up. Of course, if I'm giving a talk, if I'm in a situation that feels challenging to me, of course I'm going to have those thoughts, those what-if thoughts. But I'm not going to allow myself to get so absorbed in them, to watch that movie, to get so absorbed in that movie that my poor amygdala thinks it's really happening. And that's how worry gets us. And then worry says, all right, well, I don't like this movie, so I've got to get rid of this movie, but it's hard to get rid of this movie, so I'm just going to try and create certainty. I'm going to ask a lot of questions about this. I'm going to ask repeated questions about this. I'm going to check things repeatedly. I'm going to make sure that everything goes as planned. And you just get caught in it. It's a normal human process. The issue that I have is not that worry pops up. Of course it's going to pop up. Life is uncertain. We have very busy prefrontal cortexes. The issue is, how do you respond to it when it shows up? How do you manage your thoughts and your feelings when they arrive? Because they will. And if the goal is to stop them, to get rid of them, to deny them, that's when things backfire. So this is sort of what you need to tell yourself as you're stepping into a new school or standing up to give a presentation, is that you're stepping into uncertainty. I mean, there are times when I'm talking where, and again, like I said, if my mentor is in the room or whatever, and my hands are a little shaky. And I know before I go out, my pulse is a little bit up. And if you were watching me in one of those times, I would be talking, and my hands would be like this, so that you wouldn't see them shaking. And then once I got going, then I would be okay. I know how to manage it. So this is how to be anxious. If you want to be anxious, this is how it goes. Right? Oh gosh, I have to take a test. I have to go and get my driver's license. I have to go and get a shot. I have to go and get a blood test. I have to talk to somebody that I don't want to talk about, or that I don't want to talk to. Right? Oh, so you start thinking, what if something bad happens? Oh, here comes the movie. Let's watch the movie about the bad thing happening. The amygdala is there listening. The amygdala doesn't differentiate. Oh, that's so scary. I can't handle that. I'm out. I feel better. And if we want to see how parents and other adults reinforce it, this is how it goes. And again, the reason that it goes this way is because it works in the short term. You want your kid to get to school. You've got to get to work. People need to get to bed. We want them to participate in activities. So we start working for the cult leader. I just need to give her that reassurance. I just need to tell her that everything's going to be okay. I just need to rearrange things so that she isn't triggered, so things aren't difficult for her. And it's not all or nothing. We want to be warm and loving and supportive of our kids as they're stepping into new things. But if the goal is to get rid of those feelings, it's going to set them up for failure. So, what are the things that we can do to pay attention to this, not only if worry has shown up, but what are the preventative things that we can do? The cool thing about anxiety and its pal depression is that the skills that I teach to people who are in my office with diagnosable anxiety disorders are the same skills that I teach to prevent it from getting so powerful. The very same skills, prevention and treatment, are virtually indistinguishable. And remember those 4 things that I told you, right? Tolerating uncertainty, inability to tolerate uncertainty, lack of independent problem solving, not so great on autonomy, and perceive the world as a more dangerous place. So let's think about what are the things that everybody can do in order to manage this anxious world that we live in. Because if you haven't noticed, there's a lot of uncertainty hanging around. The content doesn't matter to me. There was a lot of uncertainty about COVID. Do you know what's taken its place this week in my office? Monkeypox. Good old monkeypox. Something else will come around. We've always got the big things like climate change and crazy people in charge or whatever, right? It's always that too. Okay, so skills that you need to learn. Emotional management. Emotional management means that when you have an emotion, you learn what to do with it. Now, as you can imagine, I'm going to say we don't learn how to get rid of it. We don't learn to stuff it down, to ignore it, to deny it, to suppress it. It'll pop out somewhere else. But it is really okay to have thoughts and feelings and sensations. In fact, a lot of them aren't even consciously mediated. We have all sorts of thoughts and feelings and sensations that we think, where the heck did that come from? Ever wake up from a dream in the morning and think, well, that was interesting that my brain just did that. What was that about? But being able to, when you have a thought or feeling and sensation, that's step 1, gonna happen, boop, gonna pop up, no way around it. Step 2 is how you manage it. Step 2 is how you learn to respond and react. There are some people, when they get angry, they lose it. My husband got called for jury duty right before the pandemic, and it was a road rage case. And some guy cut off another guy, so they had like a chase, and then they got out, and supposedly there was a gun and a bullet and blah, blah, blah. Nobody got badly hurt. But that was a road rage case. The guy had poor emotional management skills. Really lousy emotional management skills. If you are nervous about something, there are some people who are really good at spiraling up. So I call that turning something into an emergency. There are some people who live as if life is an emergency. An overestimation of the problem, an underestimation of your resources to deal with it. The better that kids have, the more skills that kids have at emotional management, the better their mental health outcomes. And they learn emotional management, not surprisingly, from the big people. If you say to your kids, don't hit each other, and if you hit each other, I'm going to hit you, doesn't work. If you try and get them to stop screaming at each other by screaming at them, also doesn't work. We are models. They are looking at us. They are watching us. And they are taking in all the time the way that we manage things. Rigidity versus flexibility is another skill that we want to talk about. So number one, we want emotional management. Now, how do you do that, right? Parts. You pull it out. Say you've got a worry part, and you pull your worry out, and you name it Karen or Joanne or whatever. You can also pull out your angry part. I had one girl who had a volcano part. When things didn't go her way, she would explode. When she had expectations of how other people would behave, or how the field trip was going to go, or what it was going to be like during her math class, if it didn't go the way that she wanted it to go, then she would explode. That was her volcano part. She had to learn how to manage that. What were the signs that she knew that she was starting to get to that place? And could she get some distance from it? I keep doing this because creating distance between you and your emotional and cognitive patterns is an enormously helpful skill to have. Whether or not we're dealing with anxiety or depression or trauma, as soon as we create a little bit of distance and we can become observers of ourselves, gives us more control, gives us more management. So rigidity versus flexibility. Dr. Milton Erickson was a psychiatrist. He died in 1981. He lived in Phoenix, Arizona. And he was quite a rogue thinker. He was incredibly creative. He was around during the time of Freudian thinking. And he was like, yeah. But really what I want to do is I want to figure out what the problem is and then figure out how do I get in there and disrupt the pattern. And he said, all problems are problems of rigidity. Find out where the rigidity is. Find out where it is that something has to be done in a certain way, and that's where you want to put your efforts. Not everybody who's rigid is anxious. Some people are just controlling pains in the butt. But a lot of people who are rigid are anxious because, remember, anxiety says, I need things to go a certain way. And if I have a plan, and if I do the same thing, and if I check everything, it's as if you're living life walking on a tightrope. Have to be rigid. Too difficult to imagine that things would go too far afield from this idea of the way they have to be. Feels so uncomfortable. We don't trade in rigidity for chaos. Planning is important. Knowing where you're going, thinking ahead. My husband used to say to my sons all the time, think one step ahead as they were heading out the door. Think one step ahead. Sometimes they did and sometimes they didn't, but it's an important sentiment to share on a regular basis. Flexibility means handling when things don't go the way that you plan. Flexibility means handling that you feel disappointed, or that you're heartbroken, or that you screwed up, or that you embarrassed yourself, and that you did something wrong and now you have to go and figure it out. Flexibility shows up when the plan isn't working for whatever reason. Flexibility isn't chaos. It isn't do whatever you want. But it's that ability, instead of thinking that you're living life walking on a tightrope, you're living, I want you to think that you're living life walking across the Brooklyn Bridge. Right? You don't want to hurl yourself over the sides. There's boundaries to pay attention to, but you got some room to navigate. Rigidity, when you look at rigidity, when you look at the way that shows up, think about the impact it has on relationships. So think about the most rigid person you know. Might be you. Think about what it's like to deal with the rigidity of that person. So my father-in-law, who lived not far from here, he died a few years ago. He was super rigid, and he was pretty anxious, although he wouldn't have seen himself that way. And when I entered the family, I went up for Thanksgiving, and I was raised that when you go to somebody's house for Thanksgiving or something, you bring something to share, right? You offer something. Nope. He had a menu, and this is what he was going to serve. So I arrived with my, I don't even remember what it was, and he was like, no. Wouldn't serve what I brought because it wasn't on his menu. So I just brought something, after that, for the next 30 years, brought something for breakfast the next day. He could handle that. That's rigidity, needing to have things a certain way. Perfectionism is the ultimate in rigidity. It's the ultimate all or nothing, right? Either it's perfect or it's a disaster. I get perfect grades or it's terrible. My braid is perfect or it's a disaster. I had one girl that would measure. She'd put a ponytail in, and she would measure from her hairline this way and her hairline this way, and it had to be exactly in the center of her head, or else she had to take it out and start over. I know, that's pretty nutty, isn't it? She didn't graduate from high school on time because she couldn't get to school, because it's really hard to get your ponytail in the middle of your head. She missed a lot of classes. So what happens with perfectionism is a few things. One is that we love it. We love, the United States of America, we love perfectionism. We love 10s. We love holes in ones. We love perfect scores on the SATs, right? We love a 4.0. We love perfection. So it gets supported. It gets accolades. It gets celebrated, for sure. The other thing that happens with perfectionism is that it gets mistaken often for time management problems. It gets mistaken for executive function issues. Because if a student is perfectionistic, deadlines, due dates are really hard to meet because they don't want to let it go. You don't want to hand in the paper. How do you know when a paper is perfect? How do you know when you've done it perfectly? So they ask for extensions. They get extra time. And people think, well, he has difficulty managing his time, or he's a procrastinator. He just can't get started. And sometimes there are executive function issues. But I only have to ask a few questions to figure out what's really going on. They know when the paper is due. They started the paper. They just are not handing in the paper. So we have to be careful sometimes in the accommodations and the things that we do on the surface that seem to be helping. Are we supporting the very thing that's causing the problem? If you are a perfectionist, if you are dealing with a perfectionist, I once asked a little perfectionist, I asked a little kid, are you a perfectionist? And he goes, not yet. If you are a perfectionist or if you are dealing with a perfectionist, the answer to this is not to convince yourself that being mediocre is okay. So if you're somebody who likes to get good grades, who has high expectations for themselves, and somebody says to you, you're too much of a perfectionist, getting all C's is fine. That's not true. Our system isn't set up that way. If you like to get high grades because you have goals, you want to get into medical school, then getting C's is not going to work, and you'll lose that person. You'll lose them. They won't believe you. But here's the skill that I want perfectionists to learn: the ability to cut corners, the ability to differentiate when something needs your all and when you can let something go. That's a skill that comes in handy when you're trying to do something well, but you can't do it all. A boy that I see, he actually will be starting his sophomore year in college, probably any time now. So he just finished his freshman year last year. So he was a senior in high school. Dad, highly perfectionistic, OCD, everything had to be a certain way. He had a really hard time not doing things perfectly. So he comes to see me at the end of his senior year. And we've been working on this. And I've been talking to him about the ability to differentiate when you need to give it your all and when you can coast. Because sometimes you got to coast. And so he came in and he said to me, so, you know, there's that game that we're playing where you have to shoot each other with Nerf guns. So we used to call it killing as an organized sport, chaos. I don't know what they call it now. Probably not that. So he said, I'm one of the organizers of this game. The senior class would do it. It was a lot of fun. You draw a name and you have to go and assassinate somebody and blah, blah, blah. And he said, I really want to do this. I really want to get into it. I really want to win it. But I also have my calculus AP test coming up. And he said, but here's the thing. I don't need to do well on my AP calculus test. I already got into the college that I want to go to. It's not really going to count much. And I think I would like to blow it off. I think I'd not like to study for my AP calculus test so that I can have fun playing this game. And I was like, yay! I said, it took us a while to get there, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. I want you to blow off your AP calculus test. Don't tell your dad. Because this is an opportunity that's not going to come again, and you've already met your goals. You already applied to college. You already got in. You already had great grades. You can coast. This is the time to coast. And he did it, and then he didn't really study for his AP calculus test, and I think he got like a 3 or a 4. It was fine, but it didn't matter. And that's the skill. I was listening, a long time ago, I was listening to Martha Stewart talk about, somebody was asking Martha Stewart her best tip for throwing a dinner party. And I don't throw a lot of dinner parties, but I was all ears. And she said, well, here's the secret. You only have one dish that comes out of the oven. Everything else you either prepare ahead of time, is either refrigerated or room temperature. Because you can't organize it so everything's done at the same time, right? That's the bane of Thanksgiving dinner. How do you get everything? She says, so don't do it. Just have one thing that you're paying attention to and have everything else done ahead of time. I thought, oh my gosh, this is like the perfectionist entertainer, and she's saying, coast. Teaching kids that skill is enormously helpful, particularly in an environment which so supports achievement. You have to be able to coast, and you have to be able to figure out when that's okay and when it's not okay. The other really important skill is the ability to break things down into parts, the ability to sequence, the ability to notice the steps of something. So global thinking is a cognitive process when we're referring to this. Global thinking means that you paint the world with a broad brush. So you use words like always and never and nobody. Nothing ever goes my way. I always have bad luck. I'll never figure this out. Nobody understands me. Those are global terms. And when people are global in the way they view the world, that is a risk factor for anxiety and depression. We know that. That's been part of the research for years and years and years. The more global you are, the more at risk you are. So the counter to global is being able to notice parts. And again, notice how I talk about parts of people, right? You might have an angry part, you might have a worried part, but you've also got this really creative part, this really fun part. When we look at people all as one thing, when kids identify themselves as one thing, when they see themselves as only their diagnosis or only their flaw, doesn't allow them to navigate through life. It gets in the way. This is why I have such a problem currently with what's going on a lot in the mental health world, is kids really identifying themselves with their diagnosis and seeing that as the sole part of them that's in charge. And that has been, certainly was going on before the pandemic. But this is who I am. And I'm nothing else but this. And all of you need to accommodate this, because this is who I am. It's not helpful. It's the opposite of what we want to do. So, parts. You've got different parts of you. What are the parts of you that you enjoy? What are the parts of you that you want to work on? What are the weak parts in you? What are the strong parts in you? What are the parts that you love to share with other people? And what are the parts of you that maybe you're just going to keep to yourself? Education is full of sequencing and steps and parts. We're going to take a huge piece of information, a huge mound of information, and we're going to sequence it, and we're going to do a report on it, and you're going to work through your syllabus part by part by part. When my boys were little, sometimes they're 2 years apart. They're 24 and 22 right now. They both finally, whew, right, I launched them. It's a little tricky, 2020 to 2022, right? Woo, yeah, I launched them. So when they were little, they would get mad at me, and they would say, "You never let us have any fun." And I would say, I never let you have any fun. And then finally they figured it out, and they would go, "Right now, in this minute, you are not letting us have any fun." I said, yeah, that's parts. That's differentiating. Right now, I feel this way. I'm not going to feel this way forever. This is not who I am all the time. Parts and sequencing. How do we go from point A to point B? Kids need help with this, because when you get overwhelmed, we've all had this experience, right? So you're looking at your disaster of a basement, or you've moved into a new house, or you've got a new puppy or whatever, and you're like, oh my God, I will never get this done. What have I gotten myself into? And then you're like, all right, let me just start at the beginning, right? Julie Andrews style. Do, re, mi. We're just going to take it a piece at a time. The ability to pull back from that global thinking and start thinking about things in parts is preventative. That's a skill that's the opposite of what anxiety and depression want you to do, and how anxiety and depression want you to view the world, in that overwhelmed, nothing I do matters way. Catastrophic thinking versus problem solving. So catastrophic thinking is when you go to the worst case scenario. If you are a catastrophic parent, you view the world as a dangerous place, and you convey that to your kids by letting them know, watch out for this, right? So you're constantly, you're doing what I call safety chatter. Be careful, watch out, okay, let me make sure, blah, 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 blah. Catastrophic parents are good at creating anxious children. This isn't about blame, this is just how it works. You perceive the world as a more dangerous place. Doesn't mean that you don't give your kids safety instructions, but the catastrophic parent gives a safety instruction, I need you to pay attention when you're driving, and then says, and hold on one second, before you go, I just want to play the movie of disaster for you. I just want to go into detail about what awful things could happen. Now, some kids are like, oh, God. But if you have a tendency toward worry, and somebody is helping you watch those movies, then it gets things going. Catastrophic thinking is not problem solving. You can give kids positive instructions about what you want them to do without layering on all of the "and this could happen." Anxiety loves a worst case scenario. It loves to watch the disaster movie. It loves to freak you out. This is why you're not going to say, and I told the teachers this today, you're not going to say forevermore, erase this from your vernacular, what's the worst that could happen? I see that all the time as advice to give to anxious kids. Say to them, what's the worst that could happen? And anxiety's like, woohoo, now you're talking my language. Stand aside. I will tell you what can happen. That's what I thought about until 2 in the morning. What you're saying, the thing that you're conveying to them is, look, it's not going to be so bad. I've been on this earth a lot longer than you, and I know right now that you feel like this is a disaster, but you will recover from it. And you know what? Everybody farts in chemistry every once in a while. It's okay, it's okay, it's okay. You're trying to say to them, it's going to be okay. So say that. Say right now, you're really worried that this could go south. You're really worried because you're taking a risk. You feel kind of vulnerable. You're embarrassed. That's okay. But you don't have to say, what's the worst that could happen, right? Because they're like, oh, I know. If you're afraid of throwing up and somebody says, what's the worst that could happen? You're like, throwing up. So just stay away from that. And instead of supporting the catastrophic language, pay attention to how we teach kids to problem solve. A lot of the worriers that I know, and I know a lot of them, are very good problem solvers in a crisis. When there is a problem, they figure it out. Worry is there to just fill all the other empty space and to come up with everything that could happen. Catastrophic thinking feels as if you are problem solving because you're trying to stay ahead of all the possible scenarios. There was one family I worked with, and they said that they were catastrophic packers. Whenever they went on a vacation, they would pack for every possible catastrophe. Woohoo, fun in the sun. We could have diarrhea, sun poisoning, right? Lyme disease, decapitation. We've got it all taken care of. So you go off on your vacation, and you're constantly thinking about what's the worst that could happen? What's the worst that could happen? So pay attention to the catastrophic language instead of saying, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I don't. I don't know exactly what's going to happen in my life. You guys don't either. But I am fairly confident that I have the resources to deal with it, or I know where to find them. So you don't have to know all the details. You just have to count on yourself as a problem solver. I don't know how to fix everything, but I'm pretty good at asking for help. I have a horrible sense of direction. Horrible. Horrible doesn't even touch how horrible it is. I'm really good at remembering landmarks and asking for directions. And then I was probably one of the last people in the world to get a smartphone. That lady on the smartphone is really, really helpful. My husband has a sense of direction like a homing pigeon, right? So he'll be like, well, we just have to, well, I don't know where we are. We just have to cut. First he'll say something annoying like, we just have to cut a little northwest. What does that even mean? And then he says something that totally irritates me. He says, use the sun. Okay, for what? But I have figured out, have I gotten lost? Yes. Have I ever gotten lost permanently? No. Here I am. I know I have a horrible sense of direction. I don't get catastrophic about it. I problem solve. That's the skill that we want to talk about. So permanent versus temporary. Hold on, I'm just trying to see what time does that say? 6:11, okay. I had the same problem. I've got this new watch, and apparently I can't see it with my bifocal contacts in, so I'm not quite sure how to solve that problem, but it looks good. All right, permanent versus temporary. Permanent is the belief that things can't change. That's a problem. That message is pretty consistent right now amongst our youth. This is who you are. You have a mental illness. You have a disease. Your brain has got this thing wrong with it that you're going to have to deal with forever and ever and ever. This is the exact opposite message that I want kids that are dealing with anxiety or depression or broken hearts or starting a new school, or getting rejected, getting cut from a team, failing your driver's test. How many of you failed that have your driver's license? How many of you failed your driver's test the first time? Hands up. Okay, there's a smattering of you. Good, I'm in good company. How many of you hit a car during your driver's test? Oh, just me? I passed the second time. I was telling the teachers today, remember I said like I've done this before, right, when I talked, because during the pandemic, I took one son's car and backed into the other son's car in my driveway. Yeah. Yep, it was good. Fun breakfast. Permanent, the belief that things won't change gets in the way of the most important thing that I offer in my work, which is something called positive expectancy. Positive expectancy is the belief that things can change. We have tons and tons of evidence that things can change. Our brains are malleable. You young people that are here, I want you to get familiar, if you're not familiar already, with the term neuroplasticity. It means that our brains are always changing, creating new neural pathways. Sometimes we create them in negative ways, but we can create them in positive ways too. If you have been told, or if you believe that at your young age you are done, even at your old age that you are done, that your brain is set, that this is the way it works, that there's nothing you can do about it, then you need to rethink that. But that message is so pervasive, it drives me nuts. And in fact, they've done some research. You know the expression, you can't teach an old dog new tricks? Do you know what they found? Yes, you can. Old brains are malleable too. Maybe not as malleable as young brains, but we can still create a lot of new neural pathways. What happens when we get away from this idea of positive expectancy, the belief that you can change, is that we end up in this place where you're passive. Why bother? When somebody gets to the place of why bother, we got to pay attention to that. That's not a good place to be. You pathologize what our normal human experience is to the point where you begin to believe about yourself that there's something permanently and horribly wrong with you. That's really important as you guys start this new school year, and as you parents are helping your kids start this new school year, is that you are not done. And in fact, a group of researchers did a study a few years ago where they wanted to figure out how to make high school less stressful for high school students. That's a big goal. So what they did, they came up with this intervention, which was pretty slick and pretty cool. They had the incoming freshmen just do 5 or 6 hours of talking about the fact that their brains weren't done yet. Talking about how they were changeable. The message that they got, they did some writing exercises and some group exercises. The message that they got was very simply, people can change. And then off they went to do their high school. They followed these kids through, and they found that these kids reported less stress going through high school because when they came up against something, they didn't believe it to be permanent. That message that they could change was enormously helpful for them. Internally focused is another skill, another thing we want to pay attention to, because an external focus, an external connection is essential to our well-being. We are social creatures. Anxiety and depression are both internalizing disorders, and even if you don't have a disorder, what we do when we're anxious, when we're upset, is that we tend to go inside. So a lot of things out here can cause you to feel anxious and angry and depressed, but the bulk of the work happens with you talking to you about you, and it's a closed loop, and it's not particularly helpful. The research is pretty clear that when kids are engaged in activities outside of themselves, adults too, by the way, that when you are doing something that you find meaningful and engaging, we get better mental health outcomes. So much so that a group of researchers who are working with the treatment of depression in adolescents have said unequivocally that volunteerism should not be this adjunct, should not be this add-on to helping depressed teens. It should be a core part of what we're doing. Getting out of your head, getting engaged in other things. It doesn't have to, you don't have to start a nonprofit in Brazil. You just have to lift up your head and open your eyes and find ways to do meaningful things for other people. It's preventative. It's absolutely preventative. Social connection, even when we're talking about social media, which I have a lot to say about, but I'll just give you this one piece of information. There is a difference, and we looked at, researchers looked at this during the pandemic, is there's a difference between active and passive social media use. When you are passively scrolling, when you are doing what we call social comparison, when you're just looking at things and going through things and you're not engaging, that's detrimental. But if you are using social media in an active, positive way, it can be positive. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This stuff is not going away. But pay attention how you're using it. Because the problem with social media when you're using it passively is that you are experiencing hyperconnection and rejection at the very same time. And that's really hard for all of us to handle. Adults aren't doing any better with this than the young people, by the way. So negative connection, this is when we're connecting with people, but we're doing it in negative ways. So we're one-upping, so, oh, I only got 4 hours of sleep last night. Well, I only got 2 hours. We're using our negative stuff to bond and connect. We want to pay attention to that. And we want to make sure that negativity and complaining and that the negative parts of ourselves aren't the only things that we're using in order to connect with others. Because the thing to remember, anxiety and depression are highly socially influenced. Highly socially influenced. The role of the helpers is just that oftentimes when somebody is struggling, they will make relationships with other people, and those people will be the accomplices to the struggle. So they are the enablers, so to speak. Irritation. Have you guys ever felt irritated? Irritation is a signal. If you are feeling irritated a lot, if things irritate you, if you feel like your fuse is short, if you feel like you don't have anything to give, you want to pay attention to that. Because it means that you're not taking care of some basic needs of yours. If you don't get enough sleep, if you're on your screens too much, if your diet is crappy, irritation is a symptom that you are depleted. And you need to pay attention to that. I'm aware of the time because I know some of you have to go to the thing. That's over there, I think. I just point randomly. Yeah. So if you have to go, I can't see my watch now. Oh, it's about 6:20, right? These are relationship skills that I want kids to pay attention to and parents to pay attention to. How do you set good boundaries? How do you know when a relationship has sort of run its course? And how do you know when you need to repair a relationship? I don't think we've talked enough to young people about relationship repair, which really involves recognizing your part in things, talking to kids about how to apologize versus how to blame, and making sure that kids are able to have some self-awareness in what helps and what doesn't help as you're working through conflict. I don't think we've been doing enough about that. Awkward empathy is just the term that I use. I really want kids to know how to offer empathy to somebody else even when it feels uncomfortable for them. We've all done this, right? So you hear that somebody had a loss or a tragedy or whatever, and you're like, oh gosh, I just didn't know what to say. I felt so uncomfortable. Yeah, too bad you felt uncomfortable. Say it anyway. Teach kids that it's okay to step into a situation that is difficult and awkward, and it's okay if they stumble over their words, and it's okay if they say, I don't know what to say, I just want to let you know that I heard what happened and I'm really sad. Model that for them. Because so much of us, so much of the time we pull back because, oh gosh, it'll feel weird. And the thing that we have to make sure that our kids understand is that if somebody is going through a rough time, you expressing your empathy isn't going to remind them of the rough time. If a friend loses a parent and you say, I'm really sorry, I heard that your dad died, it's not like the person is going to go, oh my gosh, I forgot. Oh, now you've reminded me. They're thinking about it all the time. And they're looking for connection in that time when they're probably feeling a little disconnected and lonely. Self-disclosure, what do you share and what you don't share? Self-disclosure is neither good nor bad, it just depends on the context. We really need to work with kids to make sure, and one of the things that I say to kids is that if you've got something to share and something important about you, I want you to treat it like a little bird. And imagine that you're handing that little bird to somebody to take care of. Don't hand your little bird to somebody who's not going to take care of your little bird. Be careful with what you share, but also make sure that you don't close yourself off. Once you find somebody that you can trust, who understands your experience, being vulnerable is a really important and helpful way to connect with people that we can trust. Because we're all having similar experiences here on planet Earth. And then emotional literacy is just the ability to have a more nuanced vocabulary about what you're feeling. And the earlier we start that, the better. I always say the earlier the better, but it's never too late. So being able to talk about not just mad, sad, and glad, but how nuanced is the language that we're using. All right, so you have an important role to play in this, adults. You are the models. This is an ongoing process. None of us are a perfect parent. We all screw up. We all get into situations where we're not sure how to help. But if you think about these patterns that I've talked to you about, and you think about ways that you can offer those things, just in little nuggets. You don't have to have an hour lecture. And in fact, one of the pieces of advice that I'm going to put on a mug that I give all the time is talk 85% less, right? Shut up. Offer it. Let them hear you, empathize with them. But you don't have to talk at them. Let them be who they are. Love them, support them. They're going to screw up. You're going to screw up. But probably the most important thing that you can offer your kids in all of this, right? We certainly want to offer them love and connection, is that we want to offer them joy. Now, this does not mean joy all the time. This does not mean that when people say to me all the time, I just want my kids to be happy, and I say, all the time? Every minute? Moments of joy count. As a family, as a parent, one of the greatest gifts that you can give your kids is for them to see you being joyful. Whatever it is that you do, if you sing, if you belly laugh, if you're silly, if you turn on the music in the kitchen and you dance, and they're totally embarrassed, but they're laughing with you and at you, that counts. At the beginning of the pandemic, I know that it was April 24th. My parents, because that's my dad's birthday, my parents had flown, they were in Florida when the pandemic started, and they said, we'll ride it out here. And then after a month, my mother was like, get me out of this place. So they flew up back to New Hampshire. Couldn't see them, April 24th, 2020. My mom sent me a video. My dad had just turned 80. My mom sent me a video. It was like 12 seconds. My dad was blasting the At the Hop music, the 50s music of his day. And he was vacuuming. And he was doing the twist, which is his only dance move. And I just got this little video from my mom of my 80-year-old dad vacuuming and doing the twist. And this was in the middle of the mess. It just made me feel okay. Made me feel like things were going to be okay. So offer that to your kids. Don't hide it from them. They need to see it. Laugh. Be silly. Enjoy yourselves and let your kids see it. And that really goes farther than so many other things. I know I've thrown a lot at you, a lot of information, a lot of talking, a lot of words. Take what works, sprinkle it in, do a good job, don't be catastrophic, and love your kids. So I so appreciate you coming. If anybody wants to ask me questions, I can stick around. I know people have to get to the sports thing across the street, so please feel free to go if you want to go. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer questions. Oh, or you can applaud. Yeah. So you can find me on lots of places. There's my website. I just joined Instagram recently, figuring it out. My new book called The Anxiety Audit, 7 Sneaky Ways That Anxiety Takes Hold and How to Escape Them, will be available in October, but you can pre-order it now on Amazon. And there's a ton of free stuff. The podcast has episodes on everything you could possibly imagine, from picky eating to dealing with social anxiety. So dig into that too, and I'm easy to find. So thank you very much. Oh, no. That's how it works.